Thin Wood Walls, Chapter 11. We settled into a routine. The days passed, slowly at first, and then in a blur of sameness. Letters came from New Mexico, from Dad. He didn't say much, but what he didn't say told us a lot. My imagination filled in the unsaid, the cut out, the inked over. My imagination gave me words and images and restless nights. August swept by, September arrived. School started. As far as I knew, our teacher, Mr. Moffat, didn't rise up out of the cemetery every morning. He didn't come to school wrapped in strips of cloth. He was livelier and less scary than a mummy. But he did his job, blank-eyed, handing out assignments without a smile. At the end of the first week, he still hadn't called anyone by name. "You," he said one day, looking in my direction, "give me the subject and predicate of the sentence I've written on the board." "Me?" I said. "Yes," he said, "you, the one with the window-shade eyes." Then he smiled for the first time. His teeth were yellow from the cigarettes he chain-smoked. "Forgive me," he said. "You all have window-shade eyes, don't you?" I knew his subject and predicate, but I couldn't answer. The room went silent. I sat, a mummy, longing to be back in Mrs. Linden's classroom. "I don't know," I said finally. I decided Mr. Moffat had probably learned how to be a teacher from one of those matchbook cover colleges. I wasn't sure where he'd learned to be a person. I didn't look forward to seeing him every day. But school, doing the work, was okay. At home, we had chores and jobs. At Tule Lake there were no jobs for us. And at first that seemed like a gift, but it got boring in a hurry. The adults at least had a chance to work, either in the camp or on the farms. Mom took a job as a cook in one of the mess halls. Mike's second week at the high school, he brought home a piece of paper he'd decorated with rows of letters and numbers inside little circles. I asked him what it was. "Mrs. Watanabe had us draw these," he said, "so we can practice typing." "On a piece of paper?" "There aren't any typewriters," he said, "and she can't afford to buy even one. They barely pay the Japanese-American teachers." Mom examined Mike's drawing. She lay it down and let her fingers play over the pretend keys. "Quiet, at least," she said. "Shameful," Grandmother said. "Tomorrow we learn how to write with imaginary chalk," Mike said. The harvest had been coming in since we'd arrived, and now it was at its height. Yet we kids weren't allowed to work the fields, even to pick our own food. But one day after school, Sandy came to our barracks driving one of the old farm trucks. "You and Mike want to go out to the farms, Mr. Twain?" he said. I couldn't believe it. I said yes. Mike said yes. Mom gave her approval. Grandmother looked worried, but nodded. I asked Sandy if May could go. "Sure," he said, "if she's willing to put up with us." May was willing. Her parents agreed. We climbed into the cab, May first, then me, then Mike. Plenty of room, even with Sandy behind the wheel. He smiled at us, threw the truck into gear, and eased it away, maneuvering past Philip and another kid playing catch with a ragged old baseball. I raised my head high so they couldn't miss seeing me. The air coming in the open windows felt like heaven. I wanted to stick my head out Mike's window like a dog and let my tongue hang. But now came the part we hadn't talked about, leaving the camp. Would they let Sandy just take us out? A trickle of sweat inched down my spine. I looked at Mike. His eyes were trained on the windshield and what lay ahead. May leaned back, making herself smaller between Sandy and me. She found my hand and held on tight. Her hand was smooth and soft, but strong. "What do we do?" I said. "Relax," Sandy said, "and smile." Sandy waved to the gate guard. My stomach got a high-up, twisted-up feeling. I had always stayed away from the fences. There were reports of people getting too close and being shot. I hadn't been close to the gate since we'd arrived. Now I had a chance to ride right through it like a free person. I tried to smile. The gate opened. We crept forward, and then we were past it, accelerating. Sandy shifted gears. The truck creaked and rattled. Fresh air blasted in on us. I looked back through a curtain of dust at the camp, disappearing behind us, and I imagined leaving it for good. May hadn't let go of my hand. She had her head back. Her hair was flying like black whips. She had a huge smile on her face and tears in her eyes. Were they from the wind or something else? The something else was putting a lump in my throat. Mike's head wasn't quite out the window, but it was tilted in that direction. His thick hair was standing up, his eyes were closed, and he had a look on his face that said he was somewhere else just then. He wasn't in an old truck rolling down a rough road in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a nightmare. He opened his eyes and stuck his head all the way outside. Twisting around, he shouted toward the camp, "We're not coming back!" He leaned back in, laughing. We all laughed, but not for long. We already knew how our adventure would really end. The farms were big. There were more fields than I had imagined, more people working them, more soldiers on guard, and fences and sentry towers, even out here. But I envied the workers. They got to come out here every day, breathe the air, work the earth. I would have traded them in a minute for my hours of wasting time. Sandy drove us farm to farm, slowing the truck whenever one of us showed an interest in something, which was often. We were on the way back when he stopped next to a wide field of knee-high plants. I half expected Mr. Spooner to slide down off his tractor and walk over to visit with us for a while. I could see his smile, his cowboy hat pushed back above his sweaty forehead. "Young citizens coming out," Sandy called to a guard. The guard nodded and raised his rifle in a kind of salute, then turned his attention to a group of workers who were digging out the bushy plants and putting something into sacks. Mike jumped down, and I followed with May right behind me. We walked down a row. Heat rose from the dark ground. I smelled home. I squatted and trailed my fingers through the leaves. "What are they?" I said. Mike picked up a four-tined digging fork and handed it to me. "See for yourself." I set it next to the plant. The prongs settled into the soft soil. I positioned my foot and jumped on, driving the fork deep. I lifted. Dirt-covered lumps the size of my fist and bigger popped out of the ground. Potatoes. May picked one up. I rubbed one in my hands and watched it shed its grit. I tossed it to Mike. "Dinner," I said. May made a face. "Not raw." "Take some back," Sandy said. "Maybe your moms can do something with them." "Maybe. May's mom worked at the same mess hall as mine." "Can we?" I said. "No one's going to care if you take a few," Sandy said. We found a burlap sack and loaded a dozen potatoes into it. We sat in silence for much of the trip back. I looked at my fingernails, admiring the dirt as we rolled through the gate. That night after supper, Mom brought us baked potatoes, still warm from the oven. We sat on the floor and cut them into steaming chunks and ate them like candy. I got most of my war news from Mom or Mike or Grandmother, who spent time reading newspapers, the Newell Star, our camp paper, or the San Francisco Chronicle, or magazines like Life or Letters from Outsiders. I also listened to rumors. Who was winning? Where? What was true? What wasn't? Ray wrote me and sent a crisp dollar bill, an early birthday present. He asked how I was doing and said he was working long hours for a farmer who had no help. Then he gave me some other news. Remember Mueller? His older brother, Stephen, is dead. His ship was sunk by a U-boat in the Atlantic somewhere. He wasn't even 19 yet. Mueller is a moron, but I feel sorry for him. So did I. I imagined what it would be like to lose a brother, to have him ambushed at sea. I thought of how scary it would be to find yourself trapped in a sinking ship or floating alone in the dark with mountains of frigid water everywhere around you. I was thankful I was on dry land. I was thankful for the heat. I wrote to Ray. When Mike came back to the room, I told him about Mueller's brother. "Too bad," he said, "and he was worried about the Japs. Now he can hate the Germans, too. He can look in the mirror every day and hate himself." "You don't feel sorry for him?" "Sure, but at least his brother had a chance to serve, and when Mueller's time comes, he can make the Nazis pay." I wrote to Dad. I didn't tell him about Stephen Mueller. I said we were doing fine and that I was writing in my journal when I had things to say. I wondered if anyone would read my letter before Dad got it. What would they think of my keeping a journal? Spy stuff? Would they put black lines through my words? Mike's birthday and mine were 5 years and 2 days apart. The 2 days arrived at the end of September. Mike's birthday was the 27th. Mine was the 29th. On the 28th, May's family, her parents and 2 older brothers, and James Ito's family, his parents and his younger sister, joined us in our room for a small celebration. Philip showed up, and I invited him in, too. He didn't know we were having a party, but he brought his usual gift, his smile. The evening air had cooled, but we didn't light a fire in our stove. The bodies, packed together, made their own warmth. Mike and I opened letters from Dad wishing us a happy birthday. We ate cake Mom had gotten from the mess hall. Everyone sang to us, then she gave Mike and me gifts she'd bought at the camp canteen. Candy, playing cards, comic books, and big packages wrapped in brown paper. Coats. Mrs. O'Brien had sent them. I tried mine on. It was too big, but I didn't complain. At least it would keep me warm through the winter. Mike's fit him perfectly. May gave me a small silver cross on a chain. Maybe she thought I needed it, but it felt good around my neck and I thanked her. Grandmother gave each of us a handkerchief. Mine was embroidered with evergreen trees and a mountain that looked like Mount Rainier. Mike's had trees and a winding blue river. I held mine up to the wall. A few pins and we'd have a reminder of home. But she shook her head and pointed to her nose. They are for you to use, she said. Soon it will be time for colds. Mom handed us 2 other packages wrapped in brown paper. Smaller. Happy birthday, written on each. My name is on one. Mike's on the other. These were here when we returned tonight, Mom said. Mike didn't hesitate. He tore away the paper. Inside was a book, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I thought of Stephen Mueller. There was no note. Go ahead, little brother, Mike said. I ripped open the package. Another book. No note. But now I thought I knew who had given them to us. My book was Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Grandmother raised her eyebrows. The next day was my real birthday, and I knew what I wanted, but I knew I wouldn't get it. We still had no idea when Dad would return. One afternoon in early October, I decided it was time to try my marbles again. We finally had enough rain to hold down the dust and pack the ground. Have you ever played? I asked May. My brothers are experts, she said. They taught me. Teaching and learning are 2 different things, Dad sometimes said, but May's words sounded like a challenge. She borrowed some of her brother's marbles. I got most of mine. The ones from Ray I left in my duffel, except for the red cat's eye, the shooter. We found an area of smooth dirt in the fire break next to her barracks. She used a stick to draw a big circle, and we each put 10 marbles in the center. We decided to play for fun. Since she didn't have any, she could lose, and I didn't have any I wanted to lose. The first person to capture 10 would win. After the first shot, I knew she could play. She used this big, smoky gray agate for a shooter. It had eyes. By the time I was up to 5 marbles, she crashed into her 10th. We played again. May trying to hide her smile, me thinking she was good, but also lucky. I did better, but she won that game and another. 1 more, she said. My thumb was tender, my pride dented, but I wasn't ready to quit. Sure, I said, reaching in my pocket for the cat's eye. Have you been saving that one? Ray gave it to me. It's guaranteed. She laughed. We'll see. I got off to a good start. Ray's marble gave me confidence, but May came back and won 10-9. We called it quits. In our first game the next day, I jumped off to a lead and held it. She took the following 2, but they were close. It was a fun, easy to talk, easy to smile. When we were about to leave, May noticed the tip of something sticking out of the circle. She scraped around it with her stick and pulled it out. It was a seashell. But what was it doing here, hundreds of miles from the sea? I got another stick and dug with her. I found another shell. We found more, just below the surface. Deeper, different sizes, different shapes. All bone white. Old. But how old? I imagined an ancient ocean, deeper than all the barracks at Tule Lake stood end to end. I imagined kneeling on that ocean floor where we knelt now, looking up through a forest of green seaweed at the dim blue light far overhead. I imagined May and me plucking living shells from the sand and pushing off and rising gracefully, backs arched, faces upturned, hair flowing, like those divers I'd once envisioned. I imagined bursting through the surface and breathing ocean air and looking around and seeing nothing but May and a small boat filled with pearls, my dad at the oars. There was an ocean here, May said. I know, I told her what I'd pictured. She smiled and looked up at the blue sky as if she were kneeling on the bottom of an ocean. Where did it go? It wasn't a question that needed an answer, but I shrugged. I didn't know. I longed for the feel of the ocean on my skin. That night, I showed some of the shells to Mom and Grandmother. They had heard of a prehistoric ocean here. We can make something of these, Grandmother said. Something for this room, Mom said. She looked at the bare walls. I saw life in her eyes. I promised to bring them more. Mike wasn't as impressed. He'd learned that afternoon that he and James had been accepted to work on the farm crew. After school and on weekends, he would be gone, tasting freedom. "How old do you have to be?" I asked him. "High school." High school. Years away. Everything was so far away. I went out in the fading light, in the chill, and wrote about Mike getting outside the fences, about me staying in. I wrote about games of marbles. I didn't say who won. May wasn't there to remind me. The next morning I saw Sandy at the mess hall. I told him about the shells. After school he brought me an army shovel, the short-handled kind with a folding blade. "Two good things about this place," he said. "No foxholes or latrines to dig." I'd read about foxholes, how they sometimes became soldiers' graves. I knew the word latrines. Bad, but not much worse than the smelly outhouses we'd had at Pinedale. At least we had real bathrooms now. May and I went out and dug. We unearthed shell after shell, filling 2 paper bags. It felt good to work my muscles, to get my hands dirty. We took 1 bag to her mom, 1 to mine. Our room seemed empty without Mike, but I decided I wouldn't just wait around for him. May and I took our marbles out to the fire break. This time I drew the circle for luck. Philip and some other kids came over and watched. I was ahead by 7-4 when I took aim at her big Aggie, which she'd decided to put in the middle. I shot as hard and straight as I could and hit it square. My moment of triumph was sweet but short, then bitter. My prized marble, my red cat's eye, split in half. It lay in the dirt like 2 pieces of Humpty Dumpty. The tearing away Grandmother had called our leaving home. I had that feeling all over again, smaller, but the same. "Sorry, Joe," May said. I shrugged. I kept my face down and reached out and collected both halves, then the Aggie. But it was the last shot I made. I couldn't get any of my other marbles working. My eyes weren't quite right. We went back to my room. Mom and Grandmother and May's mom were working, sitting on a sturdy, bare wood benches at a small, square-topped table. Mom had bribed 2 of the camp carpenters with extra desserts, and they'd made us furniture out of scraps of wood. Once, Mom would have stood in Dad's shadow and waited for him to figure out a way to take care of our family's needs. He would have waded into the give and take with whoever could help us, but he wasn't here now. She was. I felt proud of her for taking over and sorry that she had to, and sorrier still for the reason why. I could barely believe what Grandmother and our mothers had done. They'd glued all the shells together to make flowers, and they were painting them with red fingernail polish. They looked real, even up close. May and I stood over the women and watched. From time to time, Grandmother would look up at me and smile. When we returned from supper, I sat by the stove with my journal and stared at the flowers in their jars, where they were drying. I imagined they were real, that I could smell them. It was the Mrs. Linden smell. I wrote about May and me digging through old ocean bottom, uncovering ancient skeletons. I wrote about our mothers turning them into wondrous new flowers. Blossoms from ageless seabeds, from nimble fingers, memories from home. As October wore on, more flowers bloomed in our room, and May's. She and I would collect the shells. Our moms and my grandmother would transform them. They kept some, gave some away, sold them to some to people who insisted on paying. Our moms rewarded us with coupons to take to the canteen, as long as we would go by the post office to mail letters. It was a long walk, a mile one way, but worth it. Even as the wind blew colder and the days grew darker, at the canteen there was candy and soda pop and a feeling, for a little while, that life was normal. I heard of a place at camp where basketball was being played. I searched it out on a Saturday morning, when I thought the chances of finding a game were good. I found a crowd of older boys and young men waiting on the sidelines of a rough dirt court with baskets and backboards mounted on poles at each end. On the court, 2 teams were going at each other, hard. Quick dribbles and clean passes and pretty shots were nowhere in sight. Instead, there were fouls and flying bodies and curses. The game ended. 5 more young men took the court to replace the losing team. I crowded my way to the sideline and towed the dirt. It was wet and heavy. It reminded me of our muddy court at Ray's house. Another game started. More pushing and banging. Shots clanged off the rims. Some of the players looked as if they'd never touched a basketball before, but they were good with the rugged stuff. "How do you get in this game?" I asked a guy standing next to me. He looked down at me. I waited for an answer. His attention went back to the game, as if he hadn't heard me. "How do you?" I said. This time he didn't even spare a glance. "Don't waste your time, Shorty," a guy on the other side of me said. I looked up to make sure he was talking to me. "Joe." "Big boys game, Joe," he said. "Spend all day here, you won't get in. You need a team." He sized me up and down. "You need about 6 years and 12 inches. "I'm better than these guys," I said. "I could go through them like a slick fish. I could sink baskets like a machine." "Doesn't matter. You won't get out there. If you did, you'd get trampled. They'd carry you off on a board." I'd run out of things to say. I decided he was right, but I stayed for a while anyway, showing him I wasn't taking him at his word. He got into the next game of animal ball. So did the guy who hadn't talked to me. They were both unskilled, but tried to make up for it with football tactics. I imagined myself stealing the ball from them, racing down court to score. I imagined the crowd of bystanders cheering. The cold was seeping into my bones. I left, certain that nobody even noticed. On my slow walk back to our barracks, I thought about returning sometime, but what good would it do? Maybe in 4 years, maybe when I was 8 inches taller and too fast to get roughed up. But by then, I'd be long gone. I prayed I'd be long gone. The end of October approached. At home, this would have meant preparing for Halloween. At Tule Lake, it meant more of the same. More days of wasting time and strange meals like rice balls and bologna, and talk of the war. At school, Mr. Moffat acted as if the war were off limits. He almost never mentioned it, and when he did, it was in a hushed, wheezy voice with cautious sideways glances. Maybe he thought we would pass his useless information along to Japanese spies, or gloat if he mentioned a Japanese victory somewhere. Maybe he didn't realize we were young citizens. The war news I got at school came before or after class, or at lunch or recess. It came from kids whose teachers did talk about the war. "Miss Armstrong says we're holding our own in the Pacific," Philip told me, and May on the way home from school one day. His smile glowed in the afternoon gloom. "What's that mean?" I said. She read us an article from a Washington, D.C. newspaper. It said that since the Battle of Midway, we've been slowing the Japanese progress. We've made some of our own. We've sank their ships and beaten back their armies. "Maybe the war will end soon," May said. "The dying will end. We could leave here." I had heard of the Battle of Midway while we were at Pinedale. It was a big and important battle, and our Navy had crippled the Japanese Navy. They shouldn't have bullied us, I said. The next morning, Philip joined us for a walk to the school. His smile was gone. He didn't talk as we trudged along. "What's the matter?" May asked. He didn't answer for a minute. Then, "This morning I told my dad what Miss Armstrong said. He told me I was being fed American lies." "You're an American," I said. Philip shook his head as if he didn't want to hear me. "Only a fool would believe them," my dad said. "The Japanese will not give up. They will never surrender. The Americans have never fought anyone like the Japanese." I lay in my bunk that night and listened to Mike and Mom and Grandmother speak in hushed voices of faraway battles and losses and gains and what it all meant. They no longer minded if I heard, if I joined in even. But what could I add? Lies? How would I know? The outside world might as well have been off in the stars. What was happening to the people back home? Had the older brothers all gone off to fight? Was Stephen Mueller just the first to die? Were the women all working in factories? 15,000 Americans were locked behind Tule Lake's fences. How could we have helped? May and Philip and I were outside with some other kids the afternoon of October 31st when Sandy and Mike drove up in a farm truck. They unloaded big muddy knobs from the back while we gathered around. "Turnips," Mike said, and at first I thought he was joking. They were more the size of melons, or pumpkins. "For jack-o'-lanterns," Sandy announced, holding up an extra big one, brushing off some mud. "Not quite as easy to carve, but they'll do." He handed out pocket knives to the kids as they came forward to choose. May and Philip and I waited for some of the younger ones to get a chance, but when we finally stepped up, Sandy gave us the one he was holding. He gave us his own knife. "Maybe you three can work together on this one," he said. "Make your mothers proud." "Carve the face of your favorite Nazi," Mike said to the kids. I pictured Hitler. Not sure how we could make that mustache of his, the soup bowl haircut. Let's make a scary one, I said to May and Philip. Something to keep the Nazis away. And the war. And maybe scare the government into freeing my dad. We sat in the dirt with the rest of the kids and took turns hollowing and carving. When we were done, our jack-o'-lanterns didn't look exactly like jack-o'-lanterns, or Hitler, but it was good. It had a hollowed-out head with a removable lid, straight-down bangs, whisker lines carved below its piggish nose, wide, crazy eyes, and a snarl of a mouth filled with crooked teeth. Mom and Grandmother and May's parents came out and admired its ugly scowl. They gave us coupons for the canteen, where we bought candles and candy corn. Philip's parents kept their sour faces in their room. After dark, he goose-stepped around us wearing a Nazi helmet carved from a turnip. We ate candy and put the jack-o'-lanterns in a half circle and lit the candles in them. Their faces flickered in the cold wind, raising goosebumps on my arms. For the first time in a long time, I prayed. The next day, a letter came from Dad. If he had written us any real news, it had been sliced away or blacked out. I love all of you, he said at the bottom. I wish I could be there to help. Thank you for being strong. Mike held the letter up to the window, to the evening's fading light. He peered at the paper. Dad says the food's improving, Mike said. Lobster, French fries, pheasant under glass, homemade rolls, angel food cake with strawberries, and whipped cream, chocolate malts with every meal. The waiters all wear tuxedos and call him Sir. Mom and Grandmother, sitting at our table, giggled. I shouldered in next to Mike and studied the letter. Dad also says he had a judo match last night, I said, squinting at the blacked-over words. He whipped the camp commander, Colonel. I glanced outside at any army car easing past our barracks. Dodge. So now Dad's in charge of the whole place. He's letting everyone go home, and then he and Joe Louis and King Kong are coming up here to challenge the Tule Lake bosses. Dad's already made our reservations for the train ride home to Thomas. For a quick moment, I pretended it was all true. But Mom and Grandmother laughed and brought me back to reality. I looked again at the last words of Dad's letter, his real words, thanking us for being strong. I didn't feel strong. I wanted him with us. I wondered what he was saying to the government people. Why wouldn't they let him go? I pinned his letter to the wall, next to the other ones, next to the pictures. After that, I would often stop and read them, imagining him saying the words, saying the made-up words. Sometimes his voice wouldn't come right away, and I would get scared. I would read the sentences over and over until I could hear it.